Hello and welcome to today's analysis with me, John Rees. The former National Head of Counter-Terrorism is to lead an inquiry into 25 Birmingham schools over allegations of a hardline Islamist plot to take them over. What began with a letter of complaint, now widely accepted as a hoax, then became a probe into education standards and now looks set to become a counter-terrorism investigation. The government has ordered over 25 emergency Ofsted inspections before Easter. Speaking of the appointment of Peter Clarke, Secretary of State for Education Michael Gove said, "I am extremely concerned by the allegations made in connection to a number of schools in Birmingham. These allegations need either to be substantiated and a firm action taken, or to be shown to be baseless. That's why I'm appointing a commissioner to oversee this work. Peter Clarke brings a wealth of relevant skills and experience and is very well placed to lead a fair and thorough assessment of the evidence and report back to me." But the appointment has been described as desperately unfortunate by the Chief Constable of West Midlands Police, Chris Sims, and as provocative by Labour MP for Birmingham, Shabana Mahmood. In the studio to discuss these issues with me and whether or not the government's response has been proportionate are Dr Tim Parsons, who worked as a Chief Inspector at the City of London Police for over 30 years, and Dr Abdul Barry, former General Secretary of the Muslim Council of Britain. On the line, we have Jahan Mahmood, who's a former advisor to the Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism in the Home Office. Welcome to you all. Tim, I think a lot of people looking at this will think, whoa, how did we get from one letter of complaint to a full-scale inquiry with the former head of counter-terrorism involved? Do you see this as proportionate?
I do see it as proportionate. I actually welcome the appointment of Peter Clarke to carry out this work. I quite understand that people will have anxieties and concerns about this, and I also acknowledge that this original Trojan horse letter is of extremely dubious provenance. But moving on from that, Birmingham City Council are now saying that they're following up to 200 separate lines of inquiry around this. Peter Clarke is experienced as an executive at a very senior level in one of the UK's largest organisations. He's used to managing large and complex investigations, and more importantly, he's used to dealing with highly complex, sensitive community issues. So I would have confidence that Peter Clarke will do a good job here for the Secretary of State, and I'm sure he will do it in a sensitive and proportionate way.
Dr Barry, do you agree with that?
Well, Peter Clarke is very good in counter-terrorism operation and in his job, but this is not a counter-terrorism operation. This is an educational issue, and it started with the dubious Trojan horse letter. And for the last few weeks, the media and the politicians have come with sensationalism, sensational ideas about the Muslim community. And unfortunately, the community doesn't see in that manner. And educational issues should have been sorted out by the DFE, by the Ofsted, and of course the Birmingham City Council, and it is going on. And this appointment gives a very, very wrong message to the community and wider society. If it is seen as the Muslims as a suspect community, because the Muslims have been seen all along with the prism of security, it is going to give a very, very wrong message to the Muslim community as well as to the wider society.
Jahan Mahmood, thanks for joining us. I mean, in your experience, has there ever been anything like this, where an educational issue has been handed over to somebody whose expertise is counter-terrorism?
No, I'm certainly not familiar with this type of scenario before. What I find concerning, actually, is that Peter Clarke's remit is not really school students, governors. His remit is, of course, counter-terrorism. We're dealing with communities here as well. We have an uneasy relationship in the city for a number of reasons, and his appointment is not really a wise move by Mr. Gove. I think he's not really thought this through. We're dealing with schools, not Al-Qaeda. If we were dealing with Al-Qaeda, then okay, fair enough. But I'm afraid this is just going to make matters worse, to be honest.
I mean, Tim, what about those points? I mean, as you yourself said, there's an ongoing Birmingham City inquiry here. I mean, why not leave it at that?
Well, the problem is that because a lot of these schools are academies, Birmingham City Council has no remit to investigate them. They have no responsibility for them. So the responsibility for those schools sits fairly and squarely with the Secretary of State. So that only the Secretary of State can initiate action to address this. Now, he has Ofsted at his disposal. but he clearly thinks that this is a task that is beyond Ofsted's capabilities, and I think he's probably right in that assessment.
Dr. Barry, do you think that what's happened here is that, I mean, even if Ofsted had limited capabilities, although Ofsted is still very heavily involved in these, well, it's the body carrying out these 25 investigations, do you think even if there were a case for Michael Gove sending in a commissioner, it shouldn't have been this commissioner?
I agree with that because the educational world is totally different from counterterrorism operation. And using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, that's what people are thinking about this, is not going to help the community. It's not going to help the educational issues. Successive governments have been urging the communities and the, especially the minority communities and others to come and help in the education, being part of the civil society by being part of the governing body and others. Now Muslims, especially the young generation, have been coming forward, and Muslims are really doing quite good in education in the last few decades. And this message of using counterterrorism, very senior person will really be reverberating in the community as something very, very negative.
Jahan, do you read this as perhaps Michael Gove is a, well, let's say controversial, some would say deeply unpopular education minister. Do you think that this is he's seizing this as an opportunity to draw attention away from what many people feel is a failed or at least controversial programme in his time at the ministry?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic sideshow, distraction from other issues. I mean, I've gone into schools before where a lot of people are complaining about Mr. Gove, so it's a great way of sidetracking and focusing on something else that he himself, to be honest with you, I'm not sure he really knows how to deal with this situation. It's an allegation to start off with. There are people saying that letter was a forged letter, and that's just not the way to deal with it. I mean, what's Peter Clarke's resume? What's his experience in dealing with this type of issue? And certainly in a city where he has no understanding of the dynamics, the community relations, the demographics. It's like sending in the cavalry without sending in some kind of reconnaissance to understand the actual issue. And I just don't think he's making the right move. Are we trying to say that the entire city of Birmingham can't deal with this? But it's happily dealt with a lot of other serious and controversial issues in the past. So the police can't get it right, the council can't get it right, the LEA can't get it right, Ofsted aren't going to get it right, but somehow Peter Clarke's going to get it right. I mean, it's just absolutely ludicrous.
Tim, do you think that that this may simply? I mean, you've made the case for there being a body which isn't Ofsted, which isn't the council, looking at this. But what about this particular individual? Surely another choice would have been a better choice. Practically any other choice might have been a better choice.
Well, I mean, you can always argue that somebody else would have been better. Often it's not who's better, it's who's available and who's prepared to take on the role offered. I would have confidence in Peter Clarke carrying out this job. I know he was head of counter-terrorism, but that's not all he's done in his career. He's not head of counter-terrorism now. He's not a police officer now. He's been appointed as an education commissioner. He's experienced in dealing with complex organisations and complex investigations.
Does he actually have a history as an educationalist at all, or since he's? No,
not that I'm aware of. But his experience.
I mean, you worked in the police, and you now do have a history,
yes.
and a case could be made that a figure like yourself has education experience, and therefore, whatever they did before that, they could have been a truck driver before that. But they're now doing this. But that isn't the case for Peter Clarke.
No, it isn't. And I accept that critique. But what I would say is, he is used to operating at a senior level in a very large and complex organisation, and he's had a national remit previously as head of counter-terrorism. And he's a professional guy. He's going to tread very carefully and very sensitively around these issues. He's going to listen carefully to the advice that he's given, and he will listen to people's concerns as they're raised. So, I really don't think that this is going to end up in some sort of firestorm that is going to exacerbate and upset community sensitivities around this. I really do think this is perhaps an effective way of putting this whole issue to bed and dealing with it efficiently and effectively.
Well, Dr. Barry, have we got any indication that Peter Clarke may look into the origins of the letter in the first place? Because, I mean, it's quite a remarkable origin for this, that, you know, it seems to me that very large numbers, certainly a majority of commentators, are now saying this was a hoax. To go from a hoax complaint to this, I mean, surely at least if there's an investigation, it would look into the original complaint. Have you heard any indication that might happen?
I haven't. I am not aware of what his remit is. But the thing is, the West Midland police head himself said that he even himself didn't think of employing his own counterterrorism unit, which is very local and who is probably more knowledgeable than any other person from our side. So it's about the message, and it's probably politics behind it, which is working in many people's opinion. And you cannot simply deal an educational issue with an expert. Who I have great respect for that, but he's not for this particular job. It's not about him as a person. It's about the way that has been dealt by the Secretary of State for Education.
Jahan, do you think that it's? I mean, you were saying when I asked you before, well, you thought there might well be an element of kind of diversionary tactics by Michael Grove in this appointment. But do you think it's going to work? Is it not going to add to the problem or his problem rather than draw attention away from it?
I think we've already seen over the last few days, John, the kind of reaction. It's a collective reaction. I mean, or, you know, a response actually by the police, by the council, by members of the community, and of course some heads of school are seriously concerned. What school wants to have an investigation and at the head of it to be a counter-terrorism man from Scotland Yard who's dealt with issues like, for instance, 7/7? I mean, it's completely disproportionate, you know. They're not thinking this through. I mean, as much as I respect Tim, I think Dr. Tim would have been a better choice. But to send in someone like Peter Clarke is sending out the wrong message. And as Dr. Barry has already said, the police have already given their version of events and their response to this. And it's already damaging relationships. We've already got a mistrust issue. All we need now is to widen that gulf between some of the authorities and the community. It is, I promise you, a serious blunder.
Tim, I mean, we've already got 25 Ofsted inspections. I mean, one thing, I mean, perhaps you don't know the answer to this any more than I do, but I'm a little bit mystified about how we went from a complaint about one particular school, the Parkview Academy, to 25 schools. I mean, how do you know how that happened, or what we might expect from those reports?
I mean, I don't know how it spiralled from you know, one, you know, dubious anonymous letter as we've talked about, to, you know, what the council are now saying is 200 separate lines of inquiry. I don't know how it's managed to, you know, expand from A to B there. But, you know, again, my argument in support of Peter Clarke is, you know, that's the sort of size and scale of investigation that he'll be able to pick up. He's used to dealing with complexity like that, and perhaps prevent it, you know, spiralling out of control, so it becomes, you know, ever more sort of ridiculous in its scope, and bring it back to some sort of level of proportionate response, you know, and dealing with this in a rational and analytical way, and finding out, you know, what are the actual issues here. Forget the rhetoric, forget the politics. What's the issue here that people are concerned about? That's what we need to focus on.
Dr. Barry, do you think that perhaps part of what we're dealing with is after that initial complaint, which I guess we should say was actually given some support by one of the local MPs, Khalid Mahmood, did actually bolster that letter in the first place. But do you think after that initial process, you're dealing with something which is a little bit like one of those urban myths, that suddenly, you know, there's a kind of collective seizure and people begin reporting sightings of this and incidents of that? I mean, you know, either there is a very substantial problem, or 200 complaints have been manufactured or partly manufactured out of that kind of atmosphere. Which do you think it is?
We need to know the facts. This is essentially an educational issue, community issue. I have been a teacher all my life, And does that mean that the whole of Britain doesn't have anyone expert in the educational world to do this investigation? That's my question. And these things has been muddled in such a way that there is suspicion going on everywhere. And I think if people ask for a public inquiry, that will not be far. And I personally think something like a public inquiry probably is more useful, given that what is happening surrounding the Muslim community.
Jahan, what do you think about that? Do you think that this is going to become such a kind of, the form of the initial complaint, the scale of the Ofsted inquiry, the appointment of Peter Clarke? I mean, I guess what Dr. Barry is now saying is that this is now being blown up into such a way that almost an even bigger but more impartial inquiry is the only thing that could get to the bottom of it.
To be honest with you, I think most of the people that have gone into the schools, including our local police force, have not found anything. I don't think Peter Clarke's going to find out anything new, to be honest. It started off as a hoax letter, so, as some people have already put it. Let's just say for 1 minute that there is some element of truth in that letter. You still don't go in the way that we're currently going in. You just don't do that because it is... I mean, let's just for one moment take into consideration who's affected most by this, the students. The students of the school will be watching all of this. What about the impact on them? They're the people that we really claim to care for. But what kind of message is going out to young people who go to that particular school? So Parkview is one of the schools. Now, that has grown into 25 schools. Yes, most people haven't any clue why that's been the case. Well, I'll tell you why that's been the case. That's been the case because these 25 schools have a strong Muslim populace. That's why they've come under the spotlight. And I think that's completely unfair because I know some of the other schools who have absolutely nothing to do with this allegation at all. And Ofsted is going in and giving them a tough time. For what?
Jahan, just let me ask you a little bit more on that point you've just made there. Are all the schools, all the 25, as far as you know, are they all grouped in the Allen Rock or Small Heath area, or are they more widely dispersed across?
Yeah, they're mostly in the kind of Muslim areas. Absolutely. I mean, it's the Muslim areas that have been hard hit and worst hit because of one allegation. I mean, it started off with turning a molehill into a mountain. Now we're sitting on Mount Vesuvius. I mean, it's a volcano ready to erupt. The situation in the city is not good. If people are unhappy, then of course there needs to be an investigation. But it does not need to be led by someone who headed Scotland Yard's counter-terrorism unit. What kind of message are we sending out to kids? We claim to care about these kids. Gov claims to care about these kids. Everyone should be thinking about, but are we really thinking about the students? No, we're not. All we're thinking about is, well, we've got an agenda. There are agendas at play here. For the city of Birmingham, it's extremely damaging. For the schools, it's damaging. For the parents, it's damaging. For the kids, it's damaging. But we're putting all of that aside because we've just decided to send in the cavalry, and that's just not the solution.
Tim, I mean that's a fair point, isn't it, about the pupils? Because I mean, this school was getting good Ofsted reports. It's not that we're looking at a failing school. It's not that it's not achieving academically. Some of the things that were reported in the original letter, it seems that journalists going in shortly after that letter really didn't find a basis for that. So I mean, the escalation is. Even if you now think that the end point we've reached is a sensible one, the escalation is. I mean, I just can't remember anything like it.
Yeah, I mean, it is an unfortunate set of circumstances altogether. I think from the Secretary of State's point of view, it's not something he can just simply ignore. Or, I appreciate it's not something that he feels that he can probably leave entirely to Ofsted.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think he didn't leave it to Ofsted? Because I mean, Ofsted is hardly regarded by many people in the teaching profession as independent of the minister in any case, and certainly the new head of it is seen as being absolutely, on the Gove line. Yeah,
well, quite. But I would guess, and I don't know. Obviously, I haven't spoken to Michael Gove about this, but I would guess, he feels that there's another aspect to this. Which is not just about governance and how schools are run or administered, teaching standards and things like that. If there is, we don't know whether there is, this is the allegation, that there are some individuals who are involved for, essentially political reasons in sort of promoting a doctrine of separation and division and isolation, then clearly, you know, that's got to be identified and that's got to be challenged. And you know, and I think, you know, Peter Clarke can contribute something to that process. Now, it may be that at the end of all this, you know, he writes a report to the Secretary of State saying, "I've looked into this. There's no substance to it at all." You know, that's the end of the matter. You know, we don't know.
If that's the case, Dr. Barry, if at the end of this there's little or no substantive political involvement, because what Tim's suggesting is the reason for Peter Clarke is because there's a political agenda, if that proves to be marginal or negligible or non-existent, do you think Michael Gove should go? I mean, he will have taken an entirely local, small thing, inflated it, found nothing. I mean, some ministers might...
I think many people also think that he has been probably ill-advised to do this. And if there is political element, if there is theological element, and anyone that the Muslims are complaining against, this is not the way to do this. There are other ways of doing this. And even the local community works with the police perfectly well. And if the head of the police says it's not fair, it undermines their authority as well. So at the end of the day, there are lots of stakes in there which are not good for the society. And for Muslims, we have been seeing the deep feed of anti-Muslim bashing initially in the far-right media or tabloids. Now it's coming in the mainstream media. Who is going to check this?
OK. Well, I think that's where we're going to have to leave this part of the discussion because we're moving towards the break now. But we will be returning to this issue in part 2 of today's analysis. So come back after the break and we'll be looking at some of these issues in some more detail.